bit of environmental protection here, which is, given the recent election, I think is going to take on lots more importance maybe, or maybe it's had lots of importance over the past 8 years, and it's going to be not quite so important henceforth for the next few years, but we'll see. Lots of things can happen, certainly. It's kind of, there was another recent example of this in Japan, and it was a gal. Same thing kind of happened. Caught on fire and caused all kinds of problems. So we've got the primary reason for environmental regulation, of course, is the effective human population, right? We continue to grow and, to the four corners of the earth and et cetera. And certainly that has consequences on the environment. Some would argue adverse, some would say, not so adverse. Yeah, my wife always wanted a riding mower, so I broke down and finally got her one. Yes. Just some pure north central Montana water there. So in the 1960s, it's hard to believe that the movement really, isn't that old. 50 years that we've had an environmental movement going on. One of the big reasons for that, if you went back to the 60s and kind of looked it up, there was a river, and it was over in, I think it was in Ohio, and I can't remember, and the name was a lengthy, I think it was a Native American name that I probably can't pronounce anyhow, but the river actually caught fire. Now it seems kind of strange that a river would catch fire, but it actually caught fire and stayed ablaze for some time because of the stuff that was floating on the surface was obviously flammable. And that kind of inspired people to get going and say, we could do a little better job. And there was general agreement at that point in time that we could. And so we've got these different levels, right? Government regulation of itself, government regulation of businesses, and then suits by private individuals. And suits by private individuals have always been a part of environmental law, but certainly have taken on greater importance. So this obviously goes back a little bit when Obama was running against McCain, so it would have been 8 years ago, a little over 8 years ago. But it's amazing how energy has changed in that 8 years, and we'll talk about some of that as we go along here. But 65, 69, right? It wasn't until about 1970, again, really not that long ago, right? 46 years ago that that we a lot of this stuff kind of passed, and some of it's even more recent. And there we go. In 2007, the Supreme Court ruled in a case that it was in fact CO2 was in fact a pollutant, and then in 2009. The EPA actually called CO2 harmful to be regulated, much like mercury, smoke, ash, those types of things that might come out of a smokestack. The National Environmental Policy Act that we passed here in '69 would have set the stage for the EPA. I think that says 70 there, and it's a 69, so I'm not going to grade you or test you on dates. How's that? Okay, but the National Environmental Policy Act is what set forth the EPA, really. Okay, and we started then having environmental impact statements for projects, right? And that's projects, whether they be federal or I'm sorry, that had federal dollars, required scoping. What's the scope of the project, and what's the scope or the effect on the environment? EIS, or environmental impact statement criticisms, is we don't consider the economic injury, and they don't look at either side really in terms of the economic injury. Is there going to be injury if we don't proceed with this? Is there going to be an injury if we do? Cost benefit analysis and those types of things. And so it's a criticism. Okay. Other criticisms are that it considers too many alternatives. It's maybe more descriptive and not as analytical. a document of compliance, meaning that once we get it done, then that's basically what we have to do to comply with the project that we're going to do, right? The process limits the usefulness, and I believe that refers to the fact that it's an onerous process and it takes a long time, and can make it very difficult. And I guess I would point to the Keystone pipeline that was in process before President Obama took office and has yet to receive approval, the ultimate approval that it would need in order to proceed, right? And a lot of that has to do again with the arguments both pro and con. Right now I don't know that that's held up necessarily at the EPA. I think it's held up at other departments that have some level of administrative control or administrative, I guess control is an okay word for that. Trends, we got border issues. That's I think both between states we have those issues that arise. And greenhouse gases, of course, has become the dominant, I guess, topic when it comes to environmental concerns. Yeah, save energy is one thing, but of course in California they're about out of water in a lot of places. Partly because of drought, partly because of just simply overpopulation in those areas, trying to use the resources. Vegas is having that same problem, although it doesn't seem to detract from the growth with Lake Mead there dropping behind the Hoover Dam, Lake Mead dropping precipitously over the past couple of decades. So environmental impact statement, and we talked a little bit about that, right? Major action, there's if it's federal, if it involves any kind of federal dollars, so highways that include some federal dollars and whatnot. States probably, and ours is probably no exception, our DEQ, right? Our DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, is the state's counterpart to the EPA, and we probably have similar requirements for state-funded projects that don't have federal dollars, right? If it's the human environment, there has to be a detailed statement, right? And it examines these things, right? Adverse environmental effects, irreversible commitment of resources. So if this is going to involve committing resources, environmental resources, what's the plan? What's going to be the long-term consequences of that, right? And are there alternatives? Could we go a different direction? If it's a pipeline, those types of things. Again, this goes back, I think, 2008. So it would have gone back to President Obama about the first time he got elected, and we talk here, never pushed for nuclear, never pushed for solar or wind, or electric cars, and so now we're pushing. And of course, really in those 8 years, fracking technology, number one, and two, the discovery of oil reserves at deeper. In deeper pools. They just outlined one in Texas that's huge. I guess it's even much bigger than the Bakken, which in itself is huge, but will require fracking techniques and those types of things. But we're actually awash in oil. Oil inventories are going up. The price has been coming down. Oil per barrel was well over $100 a couple of years ago. A few years ago, which drove a lot of the interest in the drilling and whatnot, in the fracking, etc. Oil now is $45 a barrel. While we still probably complain about our gas prices, I know I do. Wasn't that long ago, it was way closer to $4. Now, just over $2 in a lot of places around the country. I think it's under $2. So, government's regulation of business was also set forth in the Environmental Protection Agency and development of that in the National Environmental Policy Act. Right, covers air pollution, water pollution, endangered species, which is interesting, pesticides, and solid waste. Also covers toxic and hazardous substances. So, again, this was interesting because 8 years ago there was a huge debate over whether or not we should open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to drilling. it would have made use the Alaskan pipeline, which of course was a huge deal. What was that in the 70s or 80s? And a lot of oil flowed through there that helped the U.S. Obviously, we weren't energy independent, but it helped us maintain some level of independence. And they've pushed to drill. They were pushing to drill up there in Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, where they knew there was huge deposits, and it could have made use of the pipeline, because the flow in the pipeline's down to, I think, less than half of what it was at one time, because the reserves there in the North Shore have started to deplete. But this is all taking a back seat now. Nobody even talks about this anymore, and again, because of the discoveries and the ability to frack and to go deeper, and drill horizontally, and all those other things. That's not even in the news. I don't even think you could find anything. You probably Google this, and you wouldn't find any information on it. And yet, 8 years ago, it was huge battle. Air pollution, right? Clean Air Act, amendments, air quality standards. We talk about primary and secondary. Primary is right here. It's what's coming out of the smokestack. Secondary, we talk more about things that are outside of the smokestack, or where that stuff goes, downwind, surrounding areas, etc., etc. We also talk about air pollution sources. It's on the test, I know it is. So stationary, again, is your smokestack. What's mobile? A lot of our pollution comes from vehicles that are on the road, right? Be it over-the-road trucks, cars, etc., etc. So just the two different types of pollution, right? Okay, and there's compliance, there's waivers, variances. They used to. It's become less of a big deal because compliance has become so much better. But you hear about cap and trade when it comes to carbon, and that has its basis in the fact that years ago there was a cap and trade basically for air pollution, for other contaminants, and I don't remember which ones. Just the basic smoke, the mercury, whatever came out, and they put caps on those. Well, if your company was able to produce energy or whatever you did, and you were well below the cap, you actually received a credit for that, which then you could sell to another company that maybe was exceeded the limits that had been set. And that was really effective, because for the first several years there was a decent amount of trading of those and whatnot. But as the companies realized that the purchasing the credits was more expensive, became more expensive than actually fixing the problem, the pollution that they had with their own plants. Now they fixed the pollution. And so I don't even know if there is an active cap and trade market so much anymore. And it is one thing that they do talk about for the greenhouse gases. 2009, right, EPA declared CO2 to be a pollutant. And that was kind of a formal designation then that allows them to regulate it. Okay. Prior to that, before they made that declaration in 2007, if you remember that other timeline, we saw that the Supreme Court had ruled that way. But prior to this declaration, then they weren't really allowed to regulate it, and now they are allowed to regulate it. And thus far, we haven't seen a ton of, I don't think, new regulations in regards to the carbon. If Trump's presidency holds true to his campaign, I doubt we will see any for the next several years. that may be on hold for a while, but I'm just kind of guessing at politics there a little bit. So air quality, this is something too, and you do see this occasionally with not necessarily bigger cities, but oftentimes cities that get inversions and whatnot, where they'll have air quality warnings out. And this is really diminished though. I would have said probably 30 years ago, if you were in LA, there probably was very few days when it was under this, and and almost never under this. And now I would say it's probably a little bit more, this and this maybe, and it's not so bad. And so we've come a long ways in helping to control that. Part of that's the emissions from, again, the mobile, but part of it from the stationary too. But in LA's case, probably more the mobile, all the driving and stuff that goes on down there. By the way, if you go to China, just about every place you go, in the city's going to be like this, and even if you get out of the city, it's like this. Horrendous air pollution when you get over there. So just awful. And you probably still see this in Montana. Probably the worst is Missoula. And again, it's not so much because Missoula puts out that much more pollution. It's because they get the inversions there, where then the pollution that's produced just kind of hangs down there in their valley and creates some kind of unhealthy conditions. So, Clean Air Act trends, so the regulation from the point source to the bubble concept. And I went back and refamiliarized myself a little bit with the bubble concept, but that really allows a company to include all of the things that they do. Okay, whether it's the smokestack or the energy production or the different things that they do, it allows them to put it all together instead of just counting maybe what the smokestack is. So if their smokestack's putting out a little too much pollution, but they're doing some other things to reduce pollution, okay, as long as the net pollution is benefited, that can be okay. Basically, that's what the bubble concept talks about. Emissions reduction banking, and again, this is what they've done. I don't know that a ton of this is happening anymore, but the reason is because it was so successful. Okay, it's not because it was unsuccessful, just the opposite. It was so successful that companies just started to comply and did a nicer job than complying with that, and made huge improvements. So we're seeing this, prevention of significant deterioration. Permitting process protects even relatively clean areas, and again, I would think that in the last 8 years that this has been pushed pretty strongly. We've seen with the clean power, what is it, CPP, clean power plants. That simply not anything Congress passed. Again, it's a push by the EPA to especially it's not necessarily targeted for coal companies, but because other forms of generation are generally in compliance, it was certainly looks like coal companies were singled out, and so we've seen. We certainly haven't seen any new coal plants being built, that's for darn sure, and we're seeing them close down right and left. We might see a slowdown of that over the next little bit. Again, here you go from back when oil wasn't plentiful and we were at the mercy of, the Middle East, mercy maybe of Exxon, and our former vice president there. We were coming out with some new things. Of course, it's kind of interesting, Mitsubishi solar plant panels, but now you'd probably say Solar City, right? And an electric car by Tesla maybe. The new inverters and batteries that Solar City / Tesla are building, so kind of cool, but nonetheless, we've seen such a overwhelming discovery of oil that I don't know. Oil's going to get to be pretty cheap, or stay relatively cheap. That may make it harder for some of those new technologies to gain footing. So, water pollution. Clean Water Act, and this is the big one, and we talked about that in some of our discussions, right? The navigable waterways. Right now, the courts have joined several states and said that we're going to hold off on some things that the EPA wanted to do because the states are suing, and the courts said, okay, we're going to issue an injunction. And that was because an order from the EPA was going to redefine basically what navigable waterways were. And it was going to change from basically, what you and I might think is a navigable waterway to anything that drained into a navigable waterway, which is practically everything, right? I mean, ultimately, any water that sits any place, will ultimately drain in. But it also, even for whatever reason, it even encompassed those areas that didn't drain. Little low spots, that held water and whatnot. They'd come under lots of regulation. So it was an interesting proposal. And at this point in time, again, it's on hold. We'll see what happens. The proposal itself may just go away with the new administration, which would eliminate the need for the court action then and the lawsuit. So, but basically what it says here is that we can't have discharge from point source without permit. And discharges were famous. I mean, companies built plants and whatnot along rivers and whatnot. So oftentimes they needed water. And then, they just let loose with the polluted water without treating it whatsoever, as did cities. Cities, from just the pollution or the sewer and whatnot, would go basically right into lakes or streams, and not lakes, but rivers and streams, probably some lakes too, and flow downstream then without being treated. And so now there has to be permits. Okay, so towns have to have permits, plants. You have to, show that the water you're releasing in there is probably every bit as clean, if not cleaner, than what you took out. So, and this is the part we've really talked about, which not yet reached, is the non-point source, and that's again the heavier regulation on agriculture and those types of things. The proposal certainly would have allowed the EPA to start looking at anyhow, regulating pesticides, herbicide applications, those types of things that farmers do right now. Install what the requirements were is that they'd have to install first best practicable technology or the second best available technology. It was kind of an either or, I guess, at that point in time. Endangered species. This is interesting. When you read you read, for example, about the grizzly bear may be delisted. Right? It's been listed, and we've been effectively, though, allowing those populations to really build, and so they're not disappearing anymore, and they've built up to pretty strong, and so they may be delisted here, I wouldn't doubt, within the next decade or so. Okay. But we still have species that get listed on a regular basis because of some of these things. So one of the things, of course, that's a concern is the destruction of habitat. And probably what we see in our country that's the biggest is the sage grouse, right? And the habitat that gets turned into farm ground. So we don't have the sagebrush there, which the sage grouse need for their leks and whatnot. So we read about that all the time, and it's a critter that's possibly going to be listed, right? Because it continues to deteriorate, or its habitat continues to deteriorate, and not just through farming, but oil and gas exploration, some of those other things, right? Disease and predation. We're seeing, though, I don't know, I would say our state does a really good job of kind of controlling populations using hunting and those types of things of wildlife, species that are game animals and whatnot. And in fact, a lot of the money that we pay for our licenses and whatnot comes back to create and improve habitat for those critters. And so, I think our state does a pretty good job anyhow in that regard. Commercial and recreational activity can create some endangered species things. I think lakes, man-made lakes, stopping the flow of water for spawning and those types of things. There can be other natural and man-made factors, of course. Pesticides, we don't talk a ton about this. There are certainly restrictions on pesticides and their use, and you and I are allowed to use pesticides and herbicides and whatnot and fertilizers and stuff at our home. And I think for the most part, there are controlled substances on farms and whatnot, but for the most part, farmers can use at least certain substances for controlling weeds and pests and whatnot without a lot of regulation. But if you do it commercially, if you want to go to your neighbors and spray over there and whatnot and charge them for that, Probably a whole different deal. You're probably required then to get certain licenses and whatnot, and go through some training. And that's what a lot of this is, and a lot of it, it's the stuff that's available then to us to buy as consumers versus stuff that maybe a commercial applicator might be able to use. There's, certain times I know that pests, you can spray them with a little bit of this or that, and that's fine and dandy. But every now and then you got to call the exterminator in because they got a little better stuff. Air and Noise Control Act. This had a lot to do with airports and whatnot, and the noise that was caused by airplanes and whatnot, and what that would do to property around airports. But it controls other things too. Solid Waste Disposal Act, right, provides a lot of technical and financial assistance for areas, like when north central Montana here, we needed to have a new solid waste disposal site. I think they helped with the location, and they ended up finding one that had a suitable, I call it ground structure or whatever. Once you went down so far, there's a lot of clay in the ground, which would prevent stuff, bad stuff from soaking down to the groundwater and whatnot. So it was deemed to be adequate, and we didn't have to put in any kind of a liner or anything like that a lot of other places maybe have to have. That we still, in spite of our computerized world and getting away, I don't give a lot of tests anymore that require paper, but in spite of all that, paper is still one of the biggest, not one of the biggest, it is the biggest component of landfill. And interesting. Organic matter, that stuff all goes away, so that's fine. Plastic, metal, and glass. Toxic substances, right? We talk about chemicals that get used again, probably pesticides, herbicides, other substances that we use, in hairspray or whatever the case may be. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and that's 76, and I was going to say that was what created Superfund, but that's not correct. Determine if waste is hazardous, waste properly transported, different things like that. I probably won't have a lot of there. Here we go. The Superfund was created in 1980 by the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. I will tell you that when it first got created, it wasn't doing a very good job, and the reason for that was pretty simple. It was really created with the idea in mind to create a partnership between the government through the Superfund and through the EPA and private industries to clean up various, especially Superfund sites. You guys have all heard the term Superfund sites, but it went backwards pretty quickly and just became a bunch of lawsuits where the government came in and accused a company of creating problems, and so it would sue the company, and sometimes it was a company that bought out a different company, and on and on. And so what do you do? And so there was lawyers were making all the money, and the money wasn't going to actually clean up things. It's worked through a lot of those problems, and now I would say it has become quite a bit more effective in doing what it's supposed to do. They do recognize some of these environmental sites. They might go after the companies to pay, but I think they work with them a lot more, negotiate settlements, or negotiate ways to clean. And I think the government contributes a little bit of money sometimes. It probably depends, on the extent to which the company was responsible for the damage. And they work it out. And don't get me wrong. I'm sure that there's still, 10,000 lawyers running around the country that make money on this, but it has improved dramatically just in the these last 30 or so years. So responsible parties can be current, former operators, and owners. This did create a dilemma for bankers when I was in the banking world, and and again, sometimes it kind of depended on who was in charge, who was president or whatnot, and what their emphasis was. But I know for a while we were really paranoid about making any kind of a real estate loan, honestly, because if the bank were to foreclose and find that there's contamination, the bank could be held responsible for cleanup. And really that's still the case, but because we've done a better job of being able to identify, the types of contamination and whatnot there might be, I think the fears have kind of gone away, and banks have gone back to lending a lot of money on real estate, whether it be commercial or or residential. But and here again in Montana, and I know the state was pretty active in that they were creating sites, and if you wanted to purchase a site that was contaminated, the bank or the state might work with you and come up with some money to help remediate that or fix the problem and put it for some money. I know when they built the new highway through town, Highway 2 through Havre, all concrete, they were offering for people who were going to be affected, but there was a lot of environmental damage, old gas stations and those types of things. And so while they were building it, they knew they'd have the equipment and everything there, and so they were offering to pitch in pretty good money for those people that wanted to fix the problem while they were building the road through town. And I think there was a lot of businesses that took advantage of that and fixed some of those issues. So due diligence is required. That means that if you purchase some real estate that might be contaminated, you're required to go through a process. Okay. So Superfund cost recoveries, again, this is cleanup that may have been done, and then the Superfund tries to recoup that from still businesses and whatnot. And it just gives you some ideas here. Hundreds of millions up to about 1.6 billion in fiscal year 08. So some businesses, the proposals, maybe prorate liability. Meaning if you're the one that just got the property and you weren't really responsible for causing the damage, maybe the liability should fall back on the prior owner. If they're inaccessible, then maybe the government would step in, those types of things. Exempt, it creates some exemptions for small contributors of waste, so that you're not paranoid about everything that you do. And site cleanup meet health and safety standards versus, I think the standard now is that you got to return it to like its original condition. So suits, right? Citizens have always had that ability to enforce environmental law, okay, and tort theories, right? So if your neighbor is doing something with the water, mining, and that's ruining the water that's coming onto your place, you have every right to sue them, right? Or if they've burning something, maybe they have an incinerator, a power plant, whatever the case may be it a company or an individual, you always have rights to sue, okay? Trespass, meaning that some of the stuff they're producing is coming over to your place, okay? And people, companies, whatever, can be held strictly liable, okay? If they're building something and spewing out contaminants that come over to your property or anybody's property, right? They can be held strictly liable for some of those things. So what's going on with the trends now, right? Concerns, loss of natural ecosystems. We see that with the development and whatnot that's going on. You'll see companies that if they want to move in a particular place, they'll agree to recreate ecosystems in a separate place. Maybe if they want to tear up or fill in a wetland, they'll create a wetland some other place, right? Ozone, you don't hear a lot about ozone. It was a big deal for a long time. The ozone was going away, and we were all going to die of sunburns or skin cancer and whatnot. And so they banned certain products, chlorofluorocarbons. I don't even know if we have to say that word anymore because they've banned their use. And you just don't hear about the ozone. I don't know if the problem's gone away or if it's just that we've moved on to the greenhouse effect, right? And how terrible that is. It's going to cause us to overheat, and now we'll all die of heat stroke instead of skin cancer, maybe. And then population growth, which just reading a cool article, just a short little article today. It was talking about how some guy back in the 60s, he predicted that population growth was going to probably by this time, caused Earth to implode, because there's no way we could support the number of people that we have. And so this has been talked about for decades and decades, that it's our population growth that's going to cause us to implode. And as yet, population keeps growing. I was looked up some stats here. They were talking about food production, how they were concerned about food production. I looked up stats that our population since about 1960 has doubled, but our food production has tripled. And so that's why people are a little. Our problem isn't that people are lacking food, or it's people have too much food. And it's so interesting, and when would our population growth exceed the world's capacity again? In the 60s, they were projecting that we'd be there by now. I'm sure they're saying in 30 years we'll be there. There's probably scientists that would say that, but I digress. Corporate governance, right? That's government regulation of corporations and regulations of themselves and the social responsibility that they bear, right? And private property, again, those types of lawsuits. So yeah, mass extinction and the consequences and whatnot. Sure. Ozone, again, yeah, chlorofluorocarbons. Say that fast 3 times. So, yep, and they did. We've quit that, right? And the chemicals no longer in production. But the chlorofluorocarbons were used both as propellants, and they were used in air conditioners and whatnot, I think. So our carbon dioxide levels are up. That's got to be like 6% per year, because I know that we're up far more than just, I would think, we're up far more than 6% since 1960. Leads to presumably warmer global temps. We might see some of these things, right? The Kyoto Protocol was put into place supposedly to lower emission levels, and there's the Paris Accord, I think, was the last one, which our President-elect has said he may or may not comply with. So the current fertility rate, right, we're going to grow to about 8 billion by then. Again, we have no idea. Right now, we have huge surpluses of food being produced every year. So I don't know that that's a huge concern. Cultural and religious issues could certainly affect the policy there. Sustainability, so yeah, we're forcing companies to be a little bit more proactive in determining whether or not their activities are sustainable in terms of the environment and whatnot. I don't know that I would have a lot on there that you would be tested on, but and now you know why he didn't ever get elected president. So there you have it, a little bit on environmental protection going on there. That took a little longer than I wanted to, nearly 40 minutes. Well, you guys, good luck on your upcoming test, and we will talk to you next week.